So I don't really have a talk today. What I have is a topic. And the topic is essentially query understanding, which some people have talked about a little bit, directly or indirectly. So the question is, here you have this wonderful search engine, has all sorts of lovely techniques in it. And most of the time when we're talking about optimizing search, we're talking about it as though there was one field. So there's one document field. We're doing search with a query against that one document field. You search for black shoes, and it looks in that field for black shoes. Well, especially in e-commerce, that's far from the reality. And you typically have many fields, and in fact, the description field often is very uninformative. The description field may be something like, these elegant pumps will set you apart at the great fiesta. What is there to search on there, right? Maybe fiesta shoes, I don't know. But you do have structured data typically. So you have structured data on the color of the shoe, the fact that it's a shoe and not a shirt, and so on. So how do you go from a query for a black shoe to this wonderful garment that is not described as a shoe? Well, obviously you want to somehow translate the query. Well, no, not obviously. If you're an engineer, you'll say, well, why don't they use the facets? Why doesn't the user just use the facets? And the first answer is, well, most systems won't even let you use the facets until you have a text query. Some will, but most will not. So you can't do anything. So second problem is, if you do put some text in, you put in black shoes, you'll get 0 results. Because in fact, none of the text says anything about black shoes. They say, oh, well, I'll do a multi-field search, and I'll search for black and shoes in whatever field. Well, that may work. That's one approach. But what I'd like to talk about is the possibility of doing something a little bit more intelligent, which is to map the query black shoes into color equals black, garment type equals shoe. Rocket science. Now, how do you do that? Well, in the past, that's been done typically by custom scripts. You think, well, let's see, let me make a list of colors, let me make a list of garment types, and see how I can map things. Or you look at the actual fields and you say, oh, there are 7 colors possible, and I will try to think of synonyms for these colors, and Bordeaux is a synonym for red, and ivory is a synonym for white, and so on. Well, of course, we have LLMs which can do this really easily. In fact, you can go to your neighborhood LLM and write a little prompt saying, I have these fields with these values. Please map this query into these fields. Now, is that the right way to do things? Probably not, because an LLM is a big hammer for a small problem. And what you'd really like to have is a more specialized model. And those models have been around for a long time, in fact, classification models. Although typically, the classification models are built for a known classification, not for any classification you throw at them. So this is just a call for thinking more about using our AI techniques, not just for re-ranking and evaluation, but also for query understanding, query interpretation. That's all really I had to say.
All right, I'll just holler it out.
Well, I'm not the moderator, but you're supposed to be. You're supposed to be recorded.
It's all the way over there. Let me know if you can't hear. So, how do? Oh, there we go.
How do we bring him?
Yes, now you can modulate your voice.
So, this problem also. Classically, you would gather user behavior and potentially look at people who wrote black shoes often clicked on a search result that had this value for color and this value for size and what have you. And so let's rewrite that query in a way that you're suggesting so that we're querying those fields with these values, right?
Absolutely. This is not new. This is just a call for, let's think about using this technique more systematically.
So, yeah, and so as we build towards collecting user data, do you have sort of thoughts about how OpenSearch can use that user data with or without LLMs to generate more accurate categorizations or metadata.
Well, John, what an original question. It's great that you remind me that more data is a good thing, because it just happens that we're working on this project to collect more data called user behavior insights. And of course, this kind of thing, you know perfectly well that the user data, even the simplest data, even just the sequence of queries by a single user, can help you with refinements. And of course, if you have behavioral data, you can do even more things. So yes, of course, if they click on this, you should be able to do that. If you want to write the analysis, please do. I'm sure someone will, or someone has. Yes, go crazy. How can I object?
And I do like the sort of let's use an LLM to generate, metadata fields and value pairs. And
Well, I did it as a sort of stupid experiment. You say, I have this LLM. Is it smart enough to do this task? And the answer is yes. Is it perfect? No, but I'm pretty sure that if I adjusted the prompt and tuned it and spent a few days on it, it would do a perfect job. And if it didn't, you can actually correct. You say, oh, well, this value isn't valid. It's ridiculous because you're saying, why am I spending 1/10 of a cent on this when it really should be done by a classification that will cost me 1/100 of a cent? But better something than nothing. Yes, Fernando.
Okay, I see you.
Yeah, so maybe one perspective on the LLM usage is that, to me, something like a tool that allows you to create a POC very quickly, because it doesn't require too much to get it working. But it's like dreaming about the future, right? So you see, okay, this is how we can get it to work. Now let's work on having a smaller model do it, as you mentioned.
Exactly.
And maybe another tool in your tool set could be also using the LLM to create the synthetic data to fine-tune a model for this classification problem, if you could create enough data. And maybe just to share an experience on this, we had a similar issue where the users of the bot or whatever, the assistant, were using huge product IDs, right? And product ID is very hard to match in this case because the user could just put like a partial product ID and then...
A partial what? I'm sorry?
Product ID. Like the ID of the product.
Oh, product ID, okay.
And then the product ID encoded some configuration of the product.
Right,
It is
right.
very complex. But then we realized, okay, let's just use the LLM to extract that ID. We have like the format of it. So then you use another database to resolve the
Sure.
product, and then it was very successful.
Sure.
I'm going to jump forward maybe 2 years, and let's say I've taken your challenge to heart, and I've built a classifier, and I can classify a query as this is going to be a color shoe query. I have an ensemble of different classifiers who can pick out parts of the query, and they all have a voice in the final ranking. At some point, when do I reach the point where I've already just re-implemented an LLM?
I don't know. I mean, maybe, again, you're talking about what's happening in 2 years. Maybe in 2 years, LLMs will be 100 times faster to run, 100 times cheaper. In which case, whatever, you don't need anything else. Maybe they won't.
So I think Stavros has fallen into a trap that a lot of us, though, in search engineering fall into. He's focused way too much on the query. And he's like, the query won't match, black shoe won't match pumps for a Fiesta, right? You're working too hard on the query. Maybe you should go instead look at the content, and maybe there's a great place to use your LLM, or you could use humans as well. Is this description a useful description for the types of queries? Does anyone ever actually search for pump and Fiesta? Let's go check our search logs. No, it's happened once in 15 years. But we see black shoes all the time.
But Eric, realistically, a lot of e-commerce companies use the descriptions they're getting from their suppliers.
Right, that's my point. So what we do is we take the description, and we know that description might even be an adversarial relationship, right? They have keywords stuff the heck out of that description. But they did give us a picture, and assuming it's not a terrible picture, let's maybe use our multimodal embeddings, and let's go ahead and pull out a real description. This is the description of these black shoes using the vocabulary of the query logs that we've had for years, but we don't actually need to build a smarter query parser or a smarter query understanding if we just rewrite the description into meaningful content.
Let 1,000 flowers bloom. So do you know what happened after 1,000 flowers bloomed? Or 100, I think, is the Chinese expression.
No, I don't.
So in 1959,
Oh, boy.
Mao said something like, I don't remember this, by the way, and I don't speak Chinese, but in 1959, Mao said, there's too much conformity here, we need more fresh ideas. And he said, let 100 flowers bloom. There was the 100 Flowers Bloom campaign. And then about a year later, he said, too many flowers.
There's something about not being the tallest blade of
Well,
grass.
yeah, exactly.
Your example was about e-commerce, and I think there it fits quite well. Where it might be a little bit more complicated is in observability use cases where I say, okay, find the bottlenecks, or have you thought about that, experimenting in this?
I think that's a very different topic. I'd love to discuss that. I think I'm an amateur at observability. I'm not an expert on observability. But since I know nothing, I have lots of ideas. And in particular, it seems to me that we need to develop observability so that you can express hypotheses directly rather than having them only between your ears. So that you can say, I suspect there's a region-based problem. I suspect there's an update problem or whatever. And then try to collect data, have the collection of the data be automatic. But that's completely orthogonal to anything I said. So I probably shouldn't say it.
Thank you.
This is fun.
I thought that wasn't where I thought you were going to go, Eric. But so I do think that you can't completely ignore the query. And in fact, it's not so much the content of the query that you want to change, but in some ways, the query captures to the best way of the tools that you make available to the user, the intent and purpose of that user, which is actually what you're trying to match. And so one thing is to, again, look at and how do we build a better query given the UI that we provide and the window that we let the user shine their intent through, right? But I do think another thing is, and I thought this was where you were going, is the kind of more jukebox model of applying different mechanisms and techniques to solving the query, right? So this is far from what you started talking about, but like it seems like if you look at the query black shoes, it has a fair degree of specificity. If you look at what should I look to get all dressed up for the fiesta, it has a low degree of specificity. And so the approach that you take to matching that query has to be in some ways equal to the specificity or lack of specificity of the query. And so the things that you apply need to be...
Well, there's that, and there's also how do you elicit more information from the user, which is something that I think no one's been talking about here, but it's an important topic. And I'll give my standard anecdote, and then it'll be the end of the query, and then I can visit the bathroom, which I'm desperate to do.
Don't let us keep you.
So I was interviewing some real users, face-to-face, in Meatland, and I was asking, so what's a query you've done lately? And this person said, oh, I was looking for a place to take my ATV, to drive around my ATV. So, okay, and what did you search for? He said, Berkshire's Lodging. And I said, well, why did you search for Berkshire's Lodging? You've heard this before. And I said, well, I wanted to take my ATV to the Berkshires, and that's far enough away that I have to stay the night. So it seems logical. And what happened? I said, well, I looked through the results, and I didn't see anything about ATVs. And I said, well, then what did you do? We looked at the second page of results, and there's nothing about ATVs. And then the third page of results. And then I said, well, then what did you do? I said, well, someone told me that I should try a different search engine. Instead of Google, I should use, at that time it was Jeeves, Ask Jeeves. So she tried Ask Jeeves, and nothing about ATVs. And then what did you do? I gave up and I asked a friend. So apparently in her mind, a search index is a lot like Yellow Pages or a card catalog where there's a list of categories and that's all you can categorize. So well, why didn't you add ATV so you can do that? So how do we help users formulate better queries? And that's bye-bye.